It was a Saturday night in June 1937, and the air inside the juke joint was thick with smoke, sweat, and whiskey. Outside, the Mississippi heat had finally broken, giving way to a cool breeze that rustled through the cotton fields. The kind of breeze that makes men think of things they shouldn't, that makes women pull their shawls tighter, even though the temperature hasn't dropped enough to justify it. The kind of breeze that carries whispers from places that don't appear on any map. But inside that weathered wooden building on the edge of Clarksdale, something else was stirring, something that would haunt 200 souls for the rest of their lives, something that would make them question everything they thought they knew about the world, about music, about the thin membrane that separates the living from whatever comes after. The building itself was unremarkable. Rough-hewn planks weathered grey by sun and rain, a tin roof that leaked in 3 places when storms rolled through, windows that didn't quite close all the way, letting in mosquitoes and moths that danced around the oil lamps. The floor was packed dirt, swept clean but never truly clean, stained dark by decades of spilled liquor and tobacco juice. The walls were decorated with advertisements for hair pomade and Lucky Strike cigarettes, faded posters for long-past political campaigns, and a single painting of Jesus with sad eyes that seemed to follow you wherever you stood. It wasn't much, but on Saturday nights it transformed. It became a cathedral of sorts, a holy place where the working people of the Delta came to forget their troubles, to drown their sorrows, to dance and drink and feel alive for a few precious hours before Sunday morning came and dragged them back to reality. The place was packed wall to wall that night, bodies pressed against bodies in the sweltering heat. Farmers with hands like leather and backs bent from years in the fields. Field workers who had spent the week under a sun that showed no mercy, picking cotton until their fingers bled. Drifters who had wandered in from God knows where, carrying everything they owned in a canvas bag, looking for work or trouble, or both. Women in their Saturday finest, dresses that had been washed and pressed and mended 100 times, hair styled with care, lipstick applied in shades of red that promised things the daylight wouldn't allow. Men with dirt still under their fingernails from a week's labor, their Sunday shirts already starting to darken with sweat in the close air. There was Big Martha, who ran a boarding house on the colored side of town, her laugh like thunder and her arms thick enough to break up any fight. There was Preacher Williams, who probably shouldn't have been there at all, but couldn't resist the pull of the music, telling himself he was there to observe the devil's work so he could better fight against it. There was young Tommy with his new wife Sarah, married just 3 weeks and still looking at each other like they'd invented love. There was old Zeke, who'd been born a slave and carried scars on his back that he never talked about, nursing a jar of moonshine and watching everything with eyes that had seen too much. They had all come for one reason. Word had spread through the Delta like wildfire, carried on lips that couldn't keep the secret, whispered in cotton fields and on street corners and in the back rooms of general stores. Robert Johnson was playing tonight. And if you knew anything about Robert Johnson, you knew that when he played, something always happened. Something you couldn't quite explain. Something that made your skin crawl and your heart race at the same time. Something that felt like standing at the edge of a cliff and looking down into darkness that went on forever. The stage, if you could call it that, was nothing more than a raised corner of the room, built from scrap lumber and railroad ties, elevated maybe 8 inches off the ground, just high enough to give the performer a sense of importance, just low enough that you could still see the dust on his shoes. A single bare bulb hung from the ceiling on a twisted length of electrical cord, swaying slightly in the breeze from the open door. The light it cast was harsh and unforgiving, creating deep shadows in every corner, making the faces of the crowd look gaunt and ghostly. The shadows seemed to move even when nothing else did, like they had a life of their own, like they were waiting for something. In the corner, an old upright piano sat silent, its ivory keys yellowed with age and cigarette smoke, several of them chipped or missing entirely. It had been played earlier in the evening by a man called Ivory Joe, who could make that broken instrument sing despite its flaws. But now it sat quiet, waiting, watching. A few chairs scattered around, mismatched and rickety, the kind you couldn't trust to hold your weight if you leaned back too far. And in the center of it all, a wooden stool waited, empty, waiting for him. The crowd had started gathering at sundown. By 9 o'clock, there wasn't an inch of space left. People stood shoulder to shoulder, the smell of bodies and perfume and pomade mixing with cigarette smoke and the sharp tang of bootleg whiskey. The heat was oppressive despite the open windows and door, the kind of heat that makes your clothes stick to your skin and your thoughts turn slow and syrupy. Someone had a harmonica and was playing idle riffs. Someone else was tapping out a rhythm on an empty bottle with a knife. The sound was festive, anticipatory, charged with an energy that felt almost electric. But underneath the noise, underneath the laughter and conversation and clinking of glasses, there was something else. A tension, an unease that nobody could quite name, but everybody felt. Like the moment before a storm breaks, when the air pressure drops and animals start acting strange and you know something is coming, but you don't know what. Several people would later say they almost left before Robert even arrived. Something in their gut telling them to go home, to get out while they still could. But they stayed. Curiosity is stronger than fear sometimes, and sometimes that's a mistake. Before we go deeper into this night, into the moment that changed everything those people believed about the world, I need you to do something. Subscribe to Soul Chronicles and turn on notifications. Because the stories we tell here, the secrets we uncover, they don't stay buried for long. And you won't want to miss what comes next. Hit that like button if this story already has your attention. And leave a comment telling me which blues legend you want to hear about next. Because every soul has a story, and some of those stories refuse to stay silent. Now let's return to that night, to that room, to those 200 witnesses who would spend the rest of their lives trying to explain what they saw. Robert Johnson arrived late. That was his way. He never came early, never made small talk, never mingled with the crowd before a show. Some said it was shyness, that despite his talent, he was still just a small-town boy who never got comfortable with attention. Others said it was arrogance, that he thought himself too good to mix with common folk. But the people who really knew, the ones who had traveled with him or shared a bottle in the early morning hours when tongues get loose, they said it was something darker, that he needed time alone before he played, time to prepare, time to make contact with whatever it was that gave him his gift, time to pay his respects to the thing that lived in his shadow. There were stories about what Robert did in those hours before a performance. Stories about him walking alone down dark roads, stopping at crossroads, standing perfectly still with his eyes closed and his lips moving in conversation with someone or something no one else could see. Stories about him visiting graveyards, sitting on tombstones, playing quiet songs that the dead could hear. Stories about him cutting his finger and letting drops of blood fall on his guitar strings before every show, a ritual whose purpose nobody wanted to think about too hard. Whether any of that was true, nobody could say for certain. But what was certain was that when Robert Johnson finally appeared, he was different from other men. There was something about him that made you take notice, made you uncomfortable, made you unable to look away, even though every instinct told you that you should. He walked through the door just after 10 o'clock, carrying his guitar case like it held something precious and dangerous at the same time. The case itself was battered and scarred, covered in stickers from places he'd been, railroad stamps and hotel labels and cryptic symbols that might have meant something or might have just been doodles to pass the time. But the way he held it, you'd think it contained gold or diamonds or the secrets of the universe. The crowd parted for him naturally, instinctively, the way water parts around a stone. Nobody told them to move. Nobody asked them to step aside. They just did, creating a path from the door to the stage. And Robert walked through that path without looking left or right, without acknowledging the people pressing back against the walls to let him pass. He was a small man, slight in build, maybe 5'8" and 130 pounds soaking wet. The kind of man you might overlook in a crowd, might not give a second glance, but up close you couldn't miss him. There was an intensity to him that had nothing to do with physical size, an energy that seemed to vibrate in the air around him. And those eyes, dark eyes that seemed to look past you rather than at you, like they were focused on something just beyond the visible world, something the rest of us couldn't see, but he could never stop seeing. He wore a dark suit that night, pressed and clean, despite the dust of the Delta roads and the miles he'd traveled. A white shirt buttoned to the collar even in the heat, a thin, dark tie, and a hat tilted low over his brow, casting his face in shadow, making his features hard to read. Everything about him was neat, controlled, carefully maintained, like he was trying to impose order on something that fundamentally resisted order, like he was wearing a costume that let him pretend to be normal when he was anything but. And those hands, Lord, those hands, impossibly long fingers that seemed to have too many joints, that moved with a fluid grace that looked almost unnatural. Later, people would swear his fingers were longer after he disappeared for those mysterious 6 months, would swear they saw him before and after, and the difference was undeniable. Fingers that had been changed, elongated, reshaped for a specific purpose. Fingers that moved across guitar strings like they were born to do nothing else, like they had never known any other function, like they existed only to create music that shouldn't be possible for human hands to make. He didn't acknowledge the crowd, didn't smile or wave or say a word. He simply walked to that stool in the corner, sat down, opened his case, and pulled out his guitar. A battered acoustic with scratches and dents that told stories of 1,000 nights in 1,000 places. He cradled it in his lap like a lover, his fingers already moving across the strings, tuning, adjusting, coaxing sounds that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the wood and wire. And then he began to play. The first notes hit the room like a physical force, like a wind that came from nowhere, like a wave crashing over everyone at once. People who had been talking stopped mid-sentence, their mouths hanging open, words forgotten before they could be spoken. Drinks froze halfway to lips, hands suspended in mid-air, as if time itself had stuttered and caught. The entire juke joint seemed to hold its breath, 200 people suddenly united in a single moment of anticipation and dread. Because this wasn't just music. This was something else, something that reached inside your chest with invisible fingers and grabbed hold of your soul and refused to let go. Something that bypassed your ears and your brain and went straight to that primal part of you that understands things without words, that knows things without learning them, that recognizes truth even when truth wears a disguise. He played Sweet Home Chicago first, his voice raw and aching, carrying pain that felt personal, even though the song was about a city most of these people had never seen. His fingers danced across the fretboard with impossible speed and precision, moving in patterns that your eyes couldn't quite follow, that seemed to blur and multiply until you weren't sure if you were seeing 2 hands or 4 or 6. The rhythm was hypnotic, relentless, pulling you deeper with every measure, every beat, every note that hung in the air like smoke before dissolving into the next. The sound that came from that guitar shouldn't have been possible. It was too full, too rich, too complete. One man, one instrument, and yet it sounded like an entire band was playing. You could hear bass lines that shouldn't have been there, percussion that came from nowhere, harmonies that seemed to materialize out of the air itself. Some people who knew music, who had played instruments themselves, would later say it was because Robert used alternate tunings, because he had developed techniques that other guitarists hadn't discovered yet. But they were lying to themselves, trying to explain away something that resisted explanation. People started swaying almost immediately, their bodies responding to something primal and ancient that lived in the music. An old woman near the back began to weep, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks, though she couldn't have said why. A young man grabbed his girl and pulled her close, needing to feel something real and solid in a moment when reality felt like it was slipping sideways. Big Martha, who never cried and never showed weakness, found herself gripping the wall for support, her massive frame trembling like a leaf in a storm. The Delta Blues had always been about feeling, about emotion too deep for words, about expressing the pain and joy and struggle of a life lived on the margins. But when Robert Johnson played, it was like he was channeling something beyond human emotion, something older, something that had existed before the first human learned to make music and would exist long after the last note faded into silence. Something that had been waiting a long time to be heard, to be given voice through a man desperate enough and talented enough to serve as its vessel. That's when the first person noticed the shadow. Her name was Clara Mae Thompson, and she was standing near the back of the room, pressed against the wall by the crowd, feeling the rough wood against her shoulders, smelling the old smoke and whiskey that had soaked into the planks over years. She was 32 years old, a school teacher who spent her weeks trying to educate children in a one-room schoolhouse with books that were falling apart and supplies that never came. Saturday night was her escape, her chance to forget about lesson plans and broken promises and a world that seemed determined to grind her down. She would later tell her grandchildren about this night, decades in the future, when she was old and gray and living in Chicago, far from the Mississippi Delta. Her voice would drop to a whisper, even in the safety of her own living room, even with sunlight streaming through the windows and grandchildren playing in the yard. Her hands would tremble as she remembered, and sometimes she would stop mid-sentence and just stare at nothing, seeing something that the rest of them couldn't see, remembering something that time had done nothing to diminish. She said she was watching Robert play, mesmerized like everyone else, her eyes fixed on his hands as they moved across the strings, creating magic out of wood and wire and whatever dark thing lived inside him. The music had her in its grip, and she was happy to be held, happy to surrender to it, to let it carry her away from everything she knew and everything she feared. But then something caught her eye, a movement in the corner of her vision, a darkness that didn't quite match the light. At first, she thought it was nothing, just a trick of the eye, just the way the shadows moved in the flickering lamplight. She tried to ignore it, tried to focus back on Robert, on the music that was filling the room and spilling out into the Mississippi night. But the movement came again, stronger this time, more insistent, like something was demanding to be noticed, demanding to be acknowledged. Clara Mae turned her head slowly, reluctantly, following that movement with her eyes. And that's when she saw it. The wall behind Robert Johnson, rough wood planks weathered to a silvery grey, illuminated by that single bare bulb swinging gently from the ceiling. The light cast Robert's shadow large and dark against the wall, hunched over his guitar, fingers moving in intricate patterns, head nodding to the rhythm he was creating. But next to it, slightly overlapping, slightly offset, was another shadow. Taller than Robert's, broader through the shoulders, standing perfectly still while Robert's shadow danced and swayed. A shadow that shouldn't have been there, a shadow that couldn't have been there. Because Robert was alone on that stage. The nearest person was 15 feet away, pressed back into the crowd. There was nothing behind him, nothing between him and the wall, nothing that could cast a shadow. Nothing visible anyway. Clara Mae felt her breath catch in her throat, felt her heart start to hammer against her ribs, felt a cold spread through her body that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the sudden, certain knowledge that she was seeing something impossible, something forbidden, something that wasn't meant for human eyes. She blinked hard, thinking it was the whiskey, though she'd only had half a glass, thinking it was the smoke, thick and acrid in the close air, thinking it was the heat, making her head swim and her vision blur. She looked away, closed her eyes tight, counted to 3, opened them again. The second shadow was still there. If anything, it seemed darker now, more solid, more present, like it was growing stronger, feeding on something, drawing substance from the music or the crowd or Robert himself. Clara May's mouth went dry. Her hands started to shake. She wanted to scream, wanted to run, wanted to do anything but stand there staring at that impossible shadow. But she couldn't move, couldn't speak, could barely breathe. She was frozen in place, pinned to the wall by fear and fascination in equal measure. She elbowed the man standing next to her, a field worker named James Davis, who she knew from church. A good man with a wife and 3 children and calluses on his hands that told the story of a life spent in hard labor. She didn't say anything, couldn't have formed words even if she'd tried. She just pointed, her hand trembling, her finger aimed at that wall where 2 shadows stood, where only one should have been. James looked at her like she'd lost her mind. Then he looked where she was pointing, and the expression on his face changed in an instant. His eyes went wide, his mouth fell open. His dark skin went pale, ashen, like all the blood had drained from his face at once. He saw it too. Word spread through the crowd like a current of electricity, invisible but undeniable, jumping from person to person like wildfire through dry grass. A whisper here passed from Clara May to James. A nudge there, James touching the woman next to him, directing her eyes toward the wall. A sharp intake of breath as that woman saw it and grabbed her husband's arm. A muttered prayer as the husband crossed himself and pointed it out to his brother. The realization moved through that packed room in waves, spreading outward from Clara May like ripples on water. Each person's discovery adding to the collective horror, the collective understanding that they were all witnessing something that shouldn't be possible. Eyes turning from Robert to the wall behind him, conversations dying mid-word. The festive atmosphere that had filled the room just minutes earlier evaporating like morning dew under a harsh sun. And one by one, 2 by 2, then in groups of 5 and 10 and 20, 200 people saw what Clara May had seen. 2 shadows where there should have been 1. Robert Johnson's shadow moving with his music, swaying and rocking, fingers flying across invisible strings. A shadow that made perfect sense, that followed the natural laws of light and dark, of substance and reflection. And beside it, that other shadow, that impossible shadow, standing, watching, waiting. The shape of it was roughly human, but wrong in ways that were hard to articulate. The proportions weren't quite right. The shoulders too broad, the arms too long, the head at an angle that suggested something broken or twisted or simply other. It stood while Robert sat. It remained motionless while Robert's body moved with the music. And though it had no face, no features, no eyes to speak of, everyone in that room felt that it was watching, observing, taking note of each and every one of them. A woman near the front started crying, soft sobs that she tried to muffle with her hand. A man beside her put his arm around her shoulders, but his own face was drawn tight with fear, his eyes locked on that wall, unable to look away even though everything in him screamed to run. Some people in that room started backing toward the door, moving slowly, carefully, trying not to draw attention to themselves, trying not to disturb whatever equilibrium was keeping that thing on the wall, instead of stepping down into the room with them. Their hands fumbled behind them for the doorframe, for the night air, for escape. But the crowd was too thick, too tightly packed, and moving through it would mean pushing, shoving, creating a commotion that might wake something that was better left sleeping. Others pressed forward instead, unable to resist, caught between terror and fascination like a mouse hypnotized by a snake. They needed to see closer, needed to understand, needed to confirm that their eyes weren't lying to them, that this impossible thing was really happening. They pushed through the crowd, squeezing between bodies, stepping on feet, murmuring apologies automatically, while their attention remained fixed on that wall, on those shadows, on the proof that the world was stranger and darker than they had ever imagined. A few women made the sign of the cross, their lips moving in silent prayer, calling on Jesus and Mary and all the saints to protect them from whatever evil had manifested in this place. Men who hadn't prayed since they were children found themselves whispering desperate pleas to God, promising to change their ways, to give up drinking and gambling and running around if only he would make this stop, make this go away, make this be nothing more than a shared hallucination brought on by bad liquor and good music. Old Zeke, who had seen things during his years in bondage that most people couldn't imagine, who carried scars, physical and psychological, that would never fully heal, stood absolutely still in the middle of the crowd. His face was impassive, showing nothing, but his hands gripped his jar of moonshine so tightly that his knuckles had gone pale. He stared at that shadow, with eyes that had witnessed horrors, with a gaze that had been forced to look at things no human should have to see. And even he, even after everything, felt fear crawl up his spine like ice water. Because they all knew the stories, they all knew the legend, they all knew what people said about Robert Johnson and how he got his talent. The crossroads at midnight, the man in black who appeared when called, the deal offered and accepted. Your soul in exchange for mastery of the guitar, for the ability to play like no human had ever played before, for fame that would outlive your body even if it couldn't save your life. Most of them had dismissed those stories as folklore, as superstition, as the kind of tale that gets told to explain things that are simply inexplicable. Robert Johnson was talented, sure, impossibly talented, but that was just genius, wasn't it? Just the confluence of natural ability and endless practice, and something ineffable that some people are born with and others can only dream of. Except now they were seeing proof. Physical, undeniable proof, a shadow that cast itself without a body to cast it. A presence that made itself known without revealing what it was. Evidence that the stories might not be stories at all, but history, truth, a warning that had gone unheeded. But Robert, he just kept playing. If he noticed the commotion, the whispers, the fear rippling through the crowd like wind through wheat, he gave no sign. His eyes were closed now, his head tilted back slightly, his whole body moving with the music. His foot tapped out the rhythm on that raised wooden stage, a steady beat that sounded like a heartbeat, like the pulse of something vast and ancient. He was deep inside the song, deep inside whatever place he went to when he played, a place the rest of them could only glimpse through the notes he coaxed from those strings, a place that existed somewhere between the world of flesh and the world of spirit, a liminal space where the rules that governed ordinary reality didn't quite apply. He transitioned seamlessly into Crossroad Blues, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. People felt it. Felt the cold seep into their bones despite the June heat and the press of bodies. Breath became visible for just a moment. Little clouds of vapor that shouldn't have existed in that sweltering space. The bare bulb flickered once, twice, casting the room into momentary darkness before surging back to life with a brightness that hurt to look at directly. That song. Everyone in the Delta knew that song. Everyone knew what it meant. Everyone could recite the words even if they'd never heard Robert sing them before, because the story they told was older than Robert, older than the blues, older than anyone could remember. The crossroads at midnight, the man who appears when you're desperate enough to call him. The deal offered in a voice like silk and honey and poison. The price of genius, the cost of desire fulfilled. And as Robert's voice rose and fell, singing about standing at the crossroads trying to flag a ride, about begging the Lord to have mercy on his poor soul, that second shadow seemed to grow darker, more defined, more present. It was no longer just an absence of light, but a presence in itself, a thing with weight and substance, pressing against the wall like it wanted to push through into the room. The edges of it became sharper. You could see the suggestion of shoulders now, the hint of arms hanging at its sides, the shape of a head that might or might not have been wearing a hat. And though it remained motionless while Robert's shadow danced, there was something about it that suggested coiled energy, potential movement, a predator holding perfectly still before the strike. A man named Willie Smokehouse Jackson, who played harmonica in local joints up and down the Delta and knew a thing or two about music and more than a thing or two about hustling, pushed his way closer to the stage. Willie was a skeptic by nature, the kind of man who trusted his eyes but questioned his mind, who needed to see things up close and personal before he believed them. He'd been in the back of the room when the whispers started, heard people talking about shadows and devils and nonsense that sounded like superstitious foolishness. Willie figured there had to be an explanation, a trick of the light maybe, some clever bit of stagecraft that Robert had rigged up to enhance his reputation. A reflection from a mirror, a cutout figure hidden somewhere, something. There was always something. Magic was just science you didn't understand yet, and Willie prided himself on understanding most things eventually. So he pushed through the crowd, ignoring the protests, stepping on feet and not apologizing, focused entirely on getting close enough to see what the real story was. He positioned himself carefully, deliberately, where he could see Robert directly and the wall behind him at the same time, where he could trace the line from light source to object to shadow, where he could figure out what trick was being played. And what he saw made his blood run cold, made his heart stutter in his chest, made every rational thought in his head evaporate like water on a hot skillet. The second shadow wasn't just standing there, it was moving. Not in time with Robert's movements, not following the rhythms of the music, but independently, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the way a clock hand moves, impossible to see in the moment but undeniable over time, like it was breathing, like it was alive, like it had its own existence separate from the light that should have been creating it but couldn't have been because there was nothing there to cast it. Willie watched, transfixed, as the shadow's chest seemed to expand and contract, watched as its fingers, long and thin and terrible, flexed slowly, one digit at a time, watched as its head, that featureless head that shouldn't have been able to see anything, turned slowly from side to side, like it was surveying the room. And though it had no face, no eyes, no features of any kind, Willie swore he could feel it watching. Not watching Robert, not watching the stage, but watching the crowd, watching them, watching it, taking note of each and every person in that room, memorizing their faces, marking them somehow for purposes Willie didn't want to think about. Willie had grown up in the Delta, had been raised on stories of haints and root workers and things that walked in the night. He'd always considered himself above such superstitions, too educated, too worldly, too smart to believe in ghosts and demons and deals with the devil. But standing there, 5 feet from that stage, staring at something that couldn't exist but undeniably did, Willie felt every dismissive comment he'd ever made about the supernatural come back to haunt him. Because this wasn't a story, this wasn't folklore passed down through generations and distorted in the telling. This was real as the sweat running down his back, as real as the floor beneath his feet, as real as the music that filled his ears and seemed to vibrate in his bones. The shadow's head continued its slow turn, scanning the crowd with whatever served it for vision, and then it stopped. Stopped with its gaze, if you could call it that, pointed directly at Willie. He felt it like a physical touch, like fingers made of ice, pressing against his face, his chest, his soul. Felt it see him, really see him, see past his skin and his skepticism and his bravado, see down to whatever it was that made Willie himself, and find him wanting or interesting or marked for later attention. Willie stumbled backward, his legs suddenly weak, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might burst. He collided with the people behind him, nearly fell, was caught by hands that grabbed his arms and steadied him. Someone asked if he was okay, their voice concerned but distant, like they were speaking from the end of a long tunnel. Willie couldn't answer, couldn't speak, could barely breathe. He didn't go near the front of that room again, not that night, not ever. In fact, Willie Jackson, who had made his living playing music in juke joints just like this one, who loved the blues more than almost anything, stopped performing entirely after that night, sold his harmonica to a pawn shop in Memphis, and took a job working on the railroad, honest labor that kept his hands busy and his mind occupied and didn't require him to ever step foot in a place where music was played and shadows might dance on walls. Robert played for 3 hours straight that night. 3 hours without stopping, without speaking, without even taking a drink of water. His fingers flew across the strings, pulling out songs that some people knew and others had never heard before. Songs that made you want to dance and cry at the same time. Songs that told stories of love and loss, of hardship and hope, of deals made and prices paid. Hellhound on My Trail came next, and the room seemed to grow darker despite the unchanged lighting. People swore later that the shadows in the corners deepened, that the air became thick and hard to breathe, that they could hear something beyond the music, a sound like distant baying, like hounds that ran on legs that had never known flesh, pursuing prey that could never escape. Robert sang about blues falling down like hail, about having to keep moving, about something hot on his trail. And that shadow on the wall seemed to lean forward slightly, seemed to press closer to Robert's own shadow, seemed almost to be whispering in his ear, though it had no mouth to whisper with. Then Me and the Devil Blues, and this is when things went from unsettling to terrifying. Robert's voice took on a different quality, deeper somehow, rougher, like it was being filtered through layers of earth and darkness. He sang about walking side by side with the devil, about going to beat his woman until he got satisfied, about burying his body down by the highway so his old evil spirit could catch a Greyhound bus and ride. And during that song, during those verses about walking with the devil, that second shadow raised its arm, slowly, deliberately, impossibly. The arm lifted from its side, rose up until it was extended outward, the hand open, palm up, like it was conducting, like it was directing Robert's hands across the strings, like it was the real source of the music pouring out of that guitar. A woman named Lucille Washington fainted dead away when she saw that, just collapsed like her strings had been cut, her body going limp and hitting the floor before anyone could catch her. Her friends had to drag her outside into the cool night air, lay her on the grass, fan her face and call her name until her eyes fluttered open. When she came to, she kept saying the same thing over and over, her voice high and thin and broken. It was him. It was the devil himself, right there on the wall, right there watching us all, watching and waiting and claiming what's his. They couldn't get her to go back inside. She sat on the grass outside that juke joint for the rest of the night, her arms wrapped around herself, rocking back and forth, humming hymns under her breath like they could protect her from what she'd seen. Inside, Robert continued his set, moving through his repertoire with a stamina that seemed superhuman. Stones in My Passway, and If I Had Possession Over Judgment Day, and 3220 Blues, each song darker than the last. Each one seemed to make that second shadow grow stronger, more solid, more real. But not everyone was terrified. That's the strange thing, the detail that makes this story even more unsettling than it already is. There were a few people, a handful in that crowd of 200, who seemed drawn to the shadow rather than repelled by it. They pushed closer to the stage, their eyes glazed, their bodies swaying to the music like they were in a trance, like they were hypnotized, like they had surrendered their will to something greater and darker than themselves. An old woman with white hair and skin like weathered leather stood in the front row, staring at that shadow with what looked like recognition, like she had seen it before, like she knew exactly what it was and maybe even why it was there. Her lips moved constantly, but no sound came out, or at least no sound that anyone else could hear. Later people would say she was a root worker, one of the old ones who knew the ways that went back before Christianity, before civilization, back to when gods walked the earth and demanded tribute in blood and bone and soul. She never spoke about what she saw that night, never confirmed or denied the stories that spread through the Delta like wildfire. But those who knew her, who had been to see her for remedies and spells and advice, they said she smiled when Robert played, smiled like she was witnessing something sacred, something powerful. Something that most people weren't supposed to see, but she had earned the right to witness through years of studying the darkness and learning its languages. A young man stood next to her, couldn't have been more than 19 or 20, his eyes wide and hungry as he stared at that shadow. His hands were moving, fingers twitching like he was playing an invisible guitar, like he was trying to absorb Robert's technique through observation and desire. After that night, he disappeared. Just packed a small bag and walked out of the Delta, and nobody saw him again for 5 years. When he came back, he could play guitar in a way he never could before. Not as good as Robert. Nobody was as good as Robert, but good enough to make people wonder. Good enough to make them ask questions he would never answer. Robert moved into Ramblin' on My Mind, his voice carrying a melancholy that seemed to fill every corner of the room. People who had been frozen in fear began to sway again, unable to resist the pull of the rhythm, the hypnotic quality of the music that seemed to bypass conscious thought and speak directly to the body, to the blood, to the ancient parts of the brain that knew dance before they knew language. Couples held each other close, moving in slow circles, finding comfort in physical contact, in the warmth of another human body, in the reminder that they were alive and present and real, even as they witnessed something that suggested reality was far more complex and dangerous than they had ever imagined. Around midnight, Robert played Traveling Riverside Blues, his slide guitar technique creating sounds that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the instrument itself. The notes bent and twisted, rising and falling in ways that shouldn't have been possible, that defied the physics of string tension and resonance, that sounded like voices crying out or laughing or singing in languages that had been dead for 1,000 years. And through it all, that shadow remained, sometimes still, sometimes moving, always present, always watching. It had become almost normal by this point, or as normal as something impossible can become when you're forced to accept its reality. People had stopped pointing at it, stopped gasping, stopped making the sign of the cross. They had adapted to it the way you adapt to any horror when exposed to it long enough. The mind can only maintain peak terror for so long before it starts to accommodate, to normalize, to file the impossible under things we don't understand but must accept. But accommodation isn't the same as acceptance, and normalization isn't the same as peace. Every person in that room felt the wrongness of what they were witnessing, felt it in their guts, in their bones, in the primitive part of their brain that screams danger when confronted with things that violate the natural order. They stayed because the music held them, because curiosity is stronger than wisdom, because they knew they were witnessing something that would define the rest of their lives, something they would tell their children and grandchildren about, something that would mark them as having been present at a moment when the veil between worlds grew thin enough to see through. Around 1 a.m, Robert finally stopped playing. He finished the last notes of Love in Vain, let them hang in the air like smoke, and then slowly opened his eyes. He looked at the crowd, really looked at them, for the first time all night, and his expression was strange, not quite a smile, not quite sadness, something in between, something knowing. He glanced over his shoulder at the wall behind him, just a quick look, a flicker of his eyes, and in that moment, everyone in that room would swear they saw him nod. Just a slight inclination of his head, like he was acknowledging someone, like he was saying thank you, or maybe I know you're there, or maybe just not yet. And then the second shadow was gone, not fading slowly, not dissolving gradually, just gone. One moment it was there, dark and solid and impossible. The next moment, only Robert's shadow remained, alone and singular, exactly as it should have been from the beginning. Robert stood up, placed his guitar carefully back in its case, and walked toward the door. The crowd parted again, but this time there was something different in the way they moved. Not just respect or fear, something else, reverence maybe, or pity. Like they had just witnessed something that had marked him, something that bound him to a fate the rest of them could only imagine. One person, a young man named Tommy Lee, who was braver or more foolish than the rest, called out as Robert passed. "Hey, Robert, that shadow. What was it, man? What did we just see?" Robert stopped, didn't turn around, stood there in the doorway with his back to the room, framed by the darkness of the Mississippi night. And he said, in a voice so quiet people had to strain to hear it, "Every man got a shadow. Some shadows just hungrier than others." Then he was gone, disappeared into the night like smoke, like he had never been there at all. The juke joint emptied quickly after that. People gathered in small groups outside, talking in hushed voices, trying to make sense of what they had seen. Some were convinced it was a trick, a con, something Robert had rigged up to enhance his reputation. Others were equally convinced they had witnessed something supernatural, something that confirmed all the darkest rumors about Robert Johnson and where his talent came from. But here's the thing that nobody could explain, the detail that silenced even the skeptics. After everyone left, the owner of the juke joint, a man named Moses Turner, went back inside to clean up. He was sweeping the floor, picking up bottles and cigarette butts when he glanced at the wall where Robert had played. And there, in the exact spot where that second shadow had stood, was a mark. A scorch mark, like something hot had pressed against the wood. The shape of it was roughly human, tall, broad-shouldered, arms at its sides. Moses tried to scrub it off, tried to sand it down, tried to paint over it. Nothing worked. The mark remained, dark and stubborn, refusing to be erased. Eventually, he just covered it with a picture frame, hung up an old photograph of some long-dead relative, but he knew it was there, always there, watching from behind the glass. Word of that night spread far and wide. 200 witnesses meant 200 stories, and even though they all saw the same thing, the details varied in the telling. Some said the shadow had horns, others said it had wings. A few claimed they saw its eyes, glowing red in the darkness. But the core of the story remained consistent. Robert Johnson had played, and something had been there with him, something that cast its own shadow, something that wanted to be seen. Researchers and blues historians would later interview as many of those witnesses as they could find. This was decades later, in the 1960s and 70s, when there was a renewed interest in Robert Johnson and the Delta Blues. By then, many of the original 200 had passed on. But those who remained, even as old men and women, even with memories faded and details blurred by time, they all insisted on one thing. They saw two shadows that night. Two shadows where there should have been one. A folklorist named Dr. Catherine Wells traveled to Clarksdale in 1972 and managed to track down 17 people who had been in that juke joint on that June night in 1937. She interviewed each one separately, never telling them what the others had said, and their stories matched, not perfectly but close enough to be unsettling. The second shadow, the coldness in the room, the way Robert had nodded to something behind him, the scorch mark on the wall. Dr. Wells wrote in her notes, which are now archived at the Library of Congress, that she had never encountered a mass sighting like this in all her years of studying folklore and legend. Usually, when multiple people claim to see something supernatural, there are wild variations in the accounts. People embellish, imagine, fill in gaps with their own fears and expectations. But in this case, the consistency was remarkable and troubling. She wrote, "Either these 17 individuals are part of an elaborate hoax that has persisted for 35 years, or they genuinely witnessed something that night that defies conventional explanation. As a scientist, I am inclined toward the former. As a human being who looked into their eyes and heard the fear still present in their voices decades later, I find myself unable to dismiss the latter." The juke joint where it happened burned down in 1952. No one knows how the fire started. It happened in the middle of the night when the place was empty and locked up tight. By the time anyone noticed the flames, the entire structure was engulfed. Firefighters managed to save a few of the neighboring buildings, but the juke joint itself was a total loss. Burned to the ground, leaving nothing but ashes and the stone foundation. Some people said it was inevitable, said that building had been marked that night in 1937, marked by whatever Robert Johnson had brought there with his music, said it was only a matter of time before the darkness consumed it completely. Others said it was just bad wiring, old wood and bad luck. But those who had been there that night, who had seen those two shadows, they knew better. They knew some things can't stay hidden forever. Some things have to be cleansed with fire. Here's something else that haunts the story. In the weeks and months following that performance, strange things started happening to some of the people who had been in that room. Not all of them, but enough to notice, enough to make others nervous. A man named Jesse Combs, who had stood right in front of the stage all night, started having nightmares. Not normal nightmares, vivid, visceral experiences where he found himself standing at a crossroads in the dark, watching two figures make a deal. He would wake up screaming, his sheets soaked with sweat, unable to shake the feeling that he had witnessed something forbidden. The nightmares continued for months until, unable to take it anymore, he went to see a root doctor. What happened in that meeting, Jesse never told anyone. But the nightmares stopped after that, and Jesse never listened to blues music again. A woman named Bertha May started seeing shadows everywhere. Not the second shadow from that night, but her own shadow, behaving strangely, moving when she was still, lingering behind when she walked forward. She became obsessed with light, keeping every lamp in her house burning from dusk till dawn, terrified of the darkness and what might emerge from it. Her family thought she was losing her mind. Maybe she was. Or maybe she had seen something that night that had opened her eyes to a reality most people are blessed to ignore. And then there was Calvin Hard Rock Williams, a gambler and hustler who feared nothing and no one. He had laughed that night when people started panicking about the shadow, laughed and called them fools and superstitious idiots. 3 months later, Calvin was found dead in his room. Heart attack, the doctor said. But those who prepared his body for burial said his face was frozen in an expression of absolute terror. And clutched in his hand was a photograph of Robert Johnson. The only photograph most people even knew existed. Where Calvin had gotten it, no one knew. But there it was, crumpled in his death grip, like he had been holding it when whatever happened to him happened. Were these incidents connected to that night, to those two shadows? There's no way to prove it, but in the Delta, where superstition and reality blur together like smoke and mist, people drew their own conclusions. They said that seeing the devil's shadow, seeing proof of the deal Robert Johnson had made, it marked you, changed you, left you vulnerable to forces that most people are protected from by their own ignorance. Robert Johnson himself would be dead just over a year later. August 1938, poisoned by a jealous husband, dying in agony on the floor of a juke joint not so different from the one where 200 people had seen his secret revealed on a wall. He was 27 years old. 27 years of life in exchange for 7 years of genius. The math of it seemed deliberate, seemed planned. Seemed like the terms of a contract written in blood and shadow. Did Robert know that night when he played for 200 witnesses that his time was running out? Did he know that the shadow beside him was growing impatient, ready to collect on the debt? Some people think he did. Think that's why he let it be seen. Think he was trying to warn people, or maybe confess, or maybe just acknowledge the truth of what he was and what he had become. There's a recording of Robert Johnson made in a hotel room in Dallas in 1937, just a few months after that night in Clarksdale. If you listen to it closely, if you turn the volume up high and listen past the music, past his voice, you can hear something else. A second voice, faint, barely audible, singing along, harmonizing in a register too low for human vocal cords. Some say it's just distortion, artifact of old recording equipment, interference. But those who believe, those who were there that night and saw what they saw, they know better. They know that voice belongs to the shadow. The shadow that followed Robert Johnson onto every stage, into every recording session, into every moment of his short, brilliant, doomed life. The question that has haunted blues scholars and supernatural investigators for decades is this: was the shadow there because of a deal Robert made? Or was Robert able to make the deal because the shadow was already there, already attached to him, already waiting for someone talented enough and desperate enough to say yes? Maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe the result is the same either way. Robert Johnson played guitar like no one before him and few since. He created music that still echoes through the decades, influencing generations of musicians who never even knew his name. He left behind 29 recorded songs that form the bedrock of American blues, rock and soul. And he left behind a legend that refuses to die, refuses to fade, refuses to be explained away by rational thought and skeptical minds. 200 people saw something impossible that night, 200 witnesses to a moment when the veil between the natural and supernatural grew thin. 200 souls who carried that memory to their graves, some speaking of it freely, others taking it to their deathbed as a secret too terrible to share. If you could ask them now, those 200, if you could reach across the years and into whatever comes after, and if you could ask them whether they regretted being there that night, what do you think they would say? Would they wish they had stayed home? Wish they had never seen Robert Johnson play? Never witnessed the shadow that proved all the dark rumors true? Or would they say, despite everything, despite the nightmares and the fear and the weight of carrying that knowledge, that they were grateful, grateful to have been there, grateful to have seen genius in its purest form, grateful to have witnessed the moment when a man and his guitar, and something older than either, created music that transcended the human and touched the divine, even if the divine wore a shadow's face. The juke joint is gone, the witnesses are gone, Robert Johnson is gone, but the story remains. And on certain nights, when the wind blows just right across the Mississippi Delta, when the moon is hidden and the darkness is complete, people say you can still hear it. Guitar music drifting across the cotton fields, a voice singing about crossroads and hellhounds and deals made in the dark. And if you listen closely, if you're brave enough or foolish enough to really listen, you might hear something else. A second voice, deeper, older, singing along. Every man got a shadow, some shadows just hungrier than others. Robert Johnson knew that better than anyone, and one night in June 1937, he let 200 people see the truth of it. See his shadow, and see the shadow that owned his soul. Before you go, before you step back into the light and try to forget what you've just heard, do me a favor. Subscribe to Soul Chronicles. Turn on notifications. Because the darkness is full of stories, and some of them demand to be told. Hit that like button if this story moved you, if it made you think, if it made you wonder about the shadows in your own life. And leave a comment. Tell me what you believe. Tell me if you think Robert Johnson sold his soul, or if he just played so brilliantly that people needed a supernatural explanation. Tell me if you've ever seen something you couldn't explain, something that changed the way you see the world. The blues isn't just music, it's truth, raw, painful, beautiful truth. And sometimes the truth casts two shadows, one in the light and one in the darkness that the light can never quite reach. Robert Johnson lived in that space between, and for one night he brought 200 people there with him, let them see what he saw, feel what he felt, know what he knew. The price of genius is always high. The question is whether it's worth paying. Robert Johnson thought it was. Even at the end, even when the poison was burning through his veins and he knew his time had come, they say he was still humming. Still making music, still feeding the hunger of the shadow that had made him great and would ultimately consume him completely. That's the story of the night 200 people watched Robert Johnson play and swore they saw two shadows. A story of music and mystery, of talent and terror, of the thin line between the possible and the impossible. A story that, like all the best blues, is both entirely true and completely unbelievable. And somewhere in the darkness that exists between the notes of a blues song, Robert Johnson is still playing, and his shadow is still watching, still waiting, still hungry, because some deals don't end with death, some deals are eternal, and some shadows never fade. That's all we have time for tonight, but the story of Robert Johnson, the legend of the man who met the devil at the crossroads and paid for his genius with his soul, that story is far from over. There are still secrets to uncover, still mysteries to explore, still shadows to shine a light on, even if that light reveals something we'd rather not see. Until next time, remember this. Be careful what you're willing to trade for the thing you want most, because someone or something is always willing to make that deal, and the price, once agreed upon, must always be paid. Always. Whether it takes 7 years or 70, whether it comes in this life or the next, the shadow will come to collect, and when it does, there's no running, no hiding, no escape. Robert Johnson knew that. 200 people witnessed the proof of it, and now you know it too. Sweet dreams.